friend Eduardo Barrera, and we're going to do a book together on epistemology. And we have this unique take on epistemology. Today we want to talk about Paul Feyerabend.
Yeah,
Can you tell us how to say Feyerabend?
Feyerabend, which means fire of the night. I love that name and the meaning in English. The fire of the night, Feyerabend. Yeah, Paul Feyerabend.
So Feyerabend was born in 1924 in Germany. Mm-hmm. He died in 1994. Yeah. We're going to fess up and say he was in the army eventually as a young man under Hitler, although he mainly just cleaned the barracks until he was sent to the front to Russia. And there he never fired a shot at another human being, but he did get a bullet that injured him, and he suffered that injury for a long, long time. It's a kind of a blank about his time in Nazism, but basically he was cleaning the barracks is what he remembers.
Yeah.
He was decorated with the Iron Cross. He lectured at the officers' school. It was 1945 that during the retreat of the Russian army, a bullet damaged his spinal nerves. Mm-hmm. That sort of thing. This is a man who had a lot of different famous colleagues. Wittgenstein, Niels Bohr, some of the other people that Karl Popper in particular. Maybe this is a good point to do our illustration.
Members of the Vienna Circle.
The Vienna Circle.
Yeah, the Vienna Circle of logical positivism. Yeah.
So one of the fun things he did, I'm going to ask you to do the illustration here, is he would start a lecture.
Well, he was a student of Karl Popper, or Sir Karl Popper, and then one day he writes in big letters, Aristotle. And then in really tiny letters, Popper. Now, Karl Popper was his mentor because he was going to work on his doctorate with Wittgenstein, because when he started to study logic, philosophy, epistemology with the Vienna School, Wittgenstein was a character that really attracted him, his way of thinking. And the year that he was going to work in his doctorate, then Wittgenstein passed away. So he had to do it with Popper, but he never liked his mentor, his main professor, Karl Popper. That's why he would do things like that. In all his work and on epistemology, and he was basically the most radical of all the philosophers of science and epistemologists. Mm-hmm. And we can summarize his philosophy of science as anything goes. So he's usually described as an anarchist epistemologist or methodological anarchist. But he never liked that, because at the time, when we think today about anarchism, we think that it's fun. We think of the Sex Pistols, we think of the punk movement of 1976, 1977, and the Situationists of Guy Debord in 1968. So we think that's something that's vibrant. But back then, in the 19th century, in the 20th century, being an anarchist was something really serious. Proudhon and Bakunin, Kropotkin, like really serious guys with a long beard and all that. So, but what Feyerabend was doing was something much more vibrant, and so he said, I prefer to be called an anarchist Dadaist.
Right.
Related to the Dada movement of 1917,
Okay.
1921.
Let me punctuate a couple of things here. So there was a time when Feyerabend was working with Karl Popper because he couldn't work with Wittgenstein. But he says he fell for falsification and he became a falsificationist.
Yeah.
But then he realized that he fell for it. Now, falsification is the idea that you try to falsify the theories that you hold dear, that you're studying, so that you can get the other perspective, and then you can get closer and closer to what Grace Ann and I in our book call a self-correcting truth. And why he fell for it, but how did he come not to appreciate Popper, who is so very popular?
Okay, now first, the best thing about Popper is that we wouldn't have Feyerabend without Popper. So first of all, and when we talk falsifiability, it's pretty much we first need to talk about verification before we talk about falsifiability, and that idea goes all the way back to David Hume, and that's when there was pretty much, and there's still a tension between rationalists and empiricists.
I got to be more of an anarchist here.
Yeah, we all do. We all have to. And then David Hume said, well, the problem with induction, and that was the title of one of the chapters.
Right, I remember.
Of Popper.
Mm-hmm.
And it has limitations. And the example that David Hume always used was that of the swans.
Black swan, white swans.
That if you verify it, then you just look for another white swan to verify that all swans are white.
Right.
And then when Europeans go to Australia, that's when they discovered that there were black swans.
Okay.
So falsifiability means that you look for a swan that is not white, not for more white swans.
Now, is that why Feyerabend said that the scientific method can be out of touch with reality?
Yeah, he said that you're too limited, and if you're just trying to falsify your hypothesis to produce more knowledge, then you're pretty much in a cage. Mm-hmm. You're in a straitjacket. You're not going to go. So that's why he would say anything goes. Just break the rules. Break the rules about science.
Now,
about research.
Popper wanted a normative epistemology, like an epistemology with standards, principles, practices that were agreed upon in the community.
Yeah.
Now, Feyerabend came to disbelieve all of that. Is that right? Am I too dismissive?
No, that is correct. Feyerabend always tried to break those rules, those steps. First, what you do is you read, you do the literature review, what everybody has tested and discovered before, and then you will come up with your research question, then your hypothesis, and then you falsify your hypothesis. But that rule of anything goes means don't follow those rules. And so he would say things like, for example, Einstein, E equal mc squared. How did he come up with that? Did he write a negative, hypothesis? No, he just dreamt it. And that's what he meant by anything goes. And one of the main examples that we used was that of medicine, and how there's in an official medicine and official system of knowledge about health, about the body, about organism that is approved and censored by the government. So Feyerabend used to say, the same way that in the Middle Ages, religion was the approved system of knowledge, the same thing today. Science is the approved system of knowledge. In the same way that we liberated ourselves from religion as the official system of knowledge, we need to do the same thing today with science.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now he wanted to study with Wittgenstein.
Yeah.
However, he came to disagree with Wittgenstein's writing, and he called it a reductio ad absurdum.
Yeah.
He said these realist theories that Wittgenstein was working with have untenable implications. We could not be said to know the meaning of words, which we nonetheless constantly use in a totally unproblematic way.
Yeah.
So, what is Feyerabend talking about when he attacks Wittgenstein?
Well, Wittgenstein.
Wittgenstein.
Yeah. Basically, his two main books, they contradict one another. So some of the things that Feyerabend didn't agree with Wittgenstein are based on his first book. That then in his second book, Wittgenstein said, remember what I wrote in the first book? Okay, this new book says that I was wrong. Everything like that. And when we talk about that relationship between Wittgenstein, Popper, and Feyerabend, it goes well before Feyerabend makes an appearance. And that's when at Cambridge, and so Popper is invited to give a lecture, and it was in the winter, it was very cold, there was snow outside, so they have a fireplace going, and Wittgenstein is there with poking the fire, and so Bertrand Russell, who was the main mentor of Wittgenstein, introduces Popper, and then Popper talks about what's the title of his lecture, and Wittgenstein immediately starts saying, no, I don't agree with the title because this and that. And the thing is that the discussion, the argument goes on that the lecture never took place.
I hear you.
Because they all were just discussing that title. And then Wittgenstein was very expressive and going like this with the fire poker at Popper. And then Popper accuses Wittgenstein of threatening him with the fire poker and all that. And then after all that, Bertrand Russell says, he tells Wittgenstein, I invited Popper so that you would meet an Austrian that was more arrogant than you. So that story about Feyerabend being critical of Popper goes way beyond, or way before. Oh, there you have that. Yeah, that's it.
This is a fire poker that I made at the blacksmith school up outside, Moriarty or something outside of Albuquerque, and see, it has a split here. If you poke him with this, you're going to take his eye out.
Oh yeah. And there's even a book. There's a book that came out about 6 years ago that's called the Wittgenstein Poker, Wittgenstein Fire Poker, something like that. Yeah.
Well, since we're talking about a material object here, one of the things that's interesting is you and I were involved for 25 years in a conference, and you would come quite frequently. Standing Conference, Management Organizational Inquiry. Acronym is C'est moi. It is us. It is me. It is I. And now we have a new conference that I hope you'll come to, which is the Quantum Storytelling Conference. Now, the segue into Niels Bohr, and Feyerabend is writing about quantum physics. And he seems to have an idea that there's this underlying elements, call them atoms, call them subatomic elements, and then there's this other thing that we can see and touch. And what was his exploration and his friendship with Niels Bohr, if you recall any of that?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, they were all part of that circle, but and the thing is that in the case of Feyerabend, the case of Thomas Kuhn, Feyerabend was very close to Kuhn, and they were both very critical of the mainstream conventions and philosophy of science. And but the thing is that if you look at all the examples used by Thomas Kuhn and then by Feyerabend, they are all about astronomy and physics. And how, in the case of Kuhn, about how quantum physics pretty much became a paradigm that displays Newtonian or thermodynamics.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is that in the social sciences, in organizational theory, in narrative inquiry, storytelling, we tend to use a lot of that terminology by Kuhn about paradigms and paradigm revolution, all that. But in the postscript that Kuhn wrote for his scientific revolution book, in the postscript for the Japanese edition, says, okay, what I wrote applies only to the natural sciences, not to the social sciences and humanities and all that. And he says, and that's because they never achieve the status of a paradigm. They all remain in a pre-paradigmatic stage. And in the case of Feyerabend, pretty much like to tear down all those borders and walls between disciplines or between one paradigm and another. Like, for example, Feyerabend used to talk about all those examples about in astronomy, and he say, yeah, we think of Kepler and Galilei and Copernicus, but the one who came up with that idea was a Pythagorean philosopher who was crazy. And so, yeah, he pretty much agree, and he's laying the foundation of what later on is going to be quantum logic or fuzzy logic, and of not following all those steps of the classic Greek philosophy of the identity principle, what it is cannot not be, and things like that.
Okay, so David Bohm is another quantum theorist that he's associated with, and he seems to have developed a kind of there's a materialist underpinning that he gets from his studies of quantum mechanics, quantum physics, etc. But then he wants to pursue, instead of incomprehensibility, He wants to pursue kind of that different researchers have different theoretical lenses, and you need to allow these lenses to interact for discovery to happen. And so I hear what you were saying in your example that, well, sometimes it's just an idiot who will come up with the right theory, or Einstein will dream E is equal to mc squared. Very, very brilliant man. But what is he talking about when he talks about incommensurability and quantum mechanics arising from concrete research, the material world? He seems to be flittering around in different kinds of epistemology. Is that right or wrong?
Incommensurability is a term that was used both by Kuhn as well as Feyerabend. And incommensurability pretty much means that if you're studying a system of knowledge, if we take, for example, in medicine, one of the things that Feyerabend didn't like at all was that for example, in the case of the United States, the AMA, the American Medical Association, pretty much has authority over chiropractors, over acupuncturists, etc. But you have to translate one system into another. And that's what, for example, in China, with the Cultural Revolution of Mao, then, there are many good things that happen in medicine. For example, the barefoot doctors that go all around China. But as a system of knowledge, of applied knowledge, of applied science, acupuncture was changed because then it was incommensurable. It could not be translated to Western medicine. So then it changes when you try to explain it just with Western terms of medicine.
Okay.
So in that process, what happened was that the explanation of acupuncture that we can see the oldest text is the Book of the Yellow Emperor. But then in the Cultural Revolution, then they tried to apply all the principles of Western medicine, talking about nerves, talking about vessels and arteries and all that, instead of what in the Book of the Yellow Emperor have to do with all the meridians and the acupuncture points, etc. So a lot of the elements that could not be translated, that were incommensurable to Western medicine. For example, there's something that are called the ghost points. The ghost points. And the ghost points were dismissed, they disappeared. So today, if somebody wants to study those ghost points, you cannot study them in China. You have to go from those who learned it in Korea or in Japan, because they kept them. But in China, they disappeared. And now they're discovering, from the Western point of view, that those are very helpful in some psychiatric therapies.
Let me give you a couple of vignettes about Feyerabend. So he's teaching in Berkeley. And it's the protests against the war, and the students are closing down the campus, etc. During his time, before these protests, Feyerabend barely showed up for his own lectures. And he wasn't that prepared. And John Searle was trying to get him fired, but then they realized it would take way too much paperwork to fire this man. So they kind of let him be. But he he realized that he wasn't wanted by the faculty at Berkeley.
Yeah.
And so during this time of the student protest, etc., he was teaching the students off campus, teaching his presentations off campus, and the students were attending. And in defiance of the Berkeley administration, in one course, he gave every student an A, regardless of their performance. You know, and it was these kinds of things that was really upsetting to the Berkeley faculty. So this guy was not, he was coloring outside the lines.
Yeah.
Put it that way.
Yeah, that was a very Freirean move. You know, Paulo Freire was against that banking education where you deposit information and then when you have the test or they write the term paper, then you take out that. So he pretty much was making that Freirean move there.
Okay, we got to wrap up this video because your modern viewer has the attention span of a gnat or a hummingbird. So there's probably nobody watching this at this point, but maybe I'll pull out a segment. But now his most famous work, I think, is Against Method, a book that he rewrote a number of times, revised at various points in his career. And then another volume 4, and Against Method. Now, you and I are writing. Are we going to be writing Against Method?
Yeah, but the thing is that you first need to know when you are critical of a perspective,
right?
You cannot just dismiss it. You need to know it, you need to study it before you can be critical of that perspective.
Gotcha.
And that's what Feyerabend did. When he wrote Against Method was because he was invited to do so by Imre Lakatos, who was his friend. Imre Lakatos was going to write the first part, which was going to be for method. So,
okay.
And then Feyerabend was going to write the second part, which was Against Method. But Imre Lakatos passes away. So then only Against Method is published. Today, you can get a book titled For and Against Method, but the first part, For Method, was not written by Imre Lakatos, but it was put together by his students who took some of his notes, some of his essays, and pretty much came up with what his For Method would have looked like.
So, we'll write this book together.
Oh yes, I'm looking forward to it.
And I don't know, I wanted to confess that I've been against epistemology for 40 years. That would be easy to write the against, but I agree. I've been putting together these lectures and YouTubes, going through the background of epistemology, and I did a thing on different kinds of phenomenologists, like Edmund Husserl, I think was the pinnacle of epistemology for epistemology, but I also want to be very much against it and move on. But here's Feyerabend is into quantum physics, and he's into, I would think, very existential things. He's into anarchy. He's into
Dadaist.
Bertolt Brecht. He says he's a Dadaist epistemologist. Is that right?
Yeah.
So, what are we going to do with this book? I don't know.
Well, it won't look like the books that we have right now. That's for sure. Yeah. So it will be much more irreverent, but not following those same recipes that.
Okay. Let me ask, and I'll move this section up to the beginning of the tape, but would you mind sharing a little bit about your own indigeneity? And I'll share that my relatives married into indigenous
Yeah.
cultures, but basically I'm white toast. You know?
Yeah, well, yeah, my great grandmother was Kickapoo. Um, she was born in Mexico because the Kickapoos, something that is different about the Kickapoos from other tribes, is that when you translate the name that all the tribes gave from themselves, you know, the Diné or the Lakota or Diné, Tono Adam, all those names they translate as people of the place, people of the earth, except Kickapoo. Kickapoo translates as he moves about.
Mm.
Yeah, and I used to be close to the last Kickapoo chief, Shakoka Aniko, and we had a good relationship together. He told me a few things about what my great grandmother used to do and all that, and there are a lot of traditions. Some traditions are tribal. They are either Kickapoo or they are Diné or they are Lakota. And there are some other ones that are pan-tribal, where members of different tribes get to participate. So I have been more pan-tribal in a way. I have a Lakota fireplace that comes from Ambrose Thompson, and I run an Ojibwe Morningstar sweat lodge. I used to do the sand dance with the Shoshones at the Wind River Reservation, and which was the original sand dance in the United States before the Lakota sand dance. And the thing with the Shoshone sand dance is that it came from Mexico.
Ah, okay.
Because historians say, oh yeah, it was brought by, and then they use the last name Trujujo, but the Sandan chief John Tarnas, who passed away, he told me actually his name was Trujillo. So those boundaries between tribes, they need to be respected, but also seeing that there's sometimes they are porous and a lot of times it's much more pan-tribal.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Now, I grew up in Spokane, Washington, where I was born, and developed a strong love for trees growing up.
Yeah.
And, as you know, I collect these broken branches from trees, and then I cut them up, and then I make these pens out of them, and I do that out on the lathe. But it's really a reverence for the aliveness of trees, and I've been very, very fond of going into the desert for. Give me the branches here, the big branch with the berries. Yeah, thank you. I can reach them. So I'm interested in how the hackberry trees are disappearing in the desert because they're being cut down and broken apart, and I'm making pens out of them, and also out of mesquite. But you can see the berries here. I want to start growing tree plants and plant 1,000 trees out where I live.
Yeah, so you're the greenhouse that you want to have for. So
I have a greenhouse I built out of earth-shift tires, tires and things.
Yes, sir. Yeah, the thing is that the way that the West look at the desert is as a wasteland, something that it's empty, it's full of life. But in the West, we have the tendency to look at things as emptiness, and then
you put things inside. But it's just a different ecological system from the forest, from the jungle, from the mountains. But in the case of the desert, it's full of life. But the West, if you look, for example, at the desert in Hollywood films, in all those Hollywood stories, the desert, who are the inhabitants of the desert? Dwarfs, people who without limbs, witches, curanderos. So all those abjects from society. So that's how the desert has been stigmatized, and how we see. We took a walk yesterday to the desert here, and it's pretty much seen as a wasteland where you go and dump all that garbage.
Yeah, and you take trees and rip them apart so you burn trees.
Yeah, because it's the way that we grow up in the West, looking at the desert as a wasteland, as emptiness, as not having life, or being something inferior to a rainforest or to.
So bring that back to your experience with Sundance and your experience, indigenous scholar. Why Feyerabend is so important?
Well, because Feyerabend didn't believe that the Western logic and the Western science was a system of knowledge that was superior to the systems of knowledge of other peoples in other cultures.
Wow.
Now,
I agree with that. Wow.
But then in the last few decades, there are some people that started to work on that ideas, those ideas. For example, Boaventura de Souza, Portuguese philosopher of science. He talks about the epistemologies of the South. And what he's trying to do is to revindicate, to say the system of knowledge of indigenous tribes is as valid as those of Western scientists. And Feyerabend is saying, how about if my child gets sick? If I don't want to take my child to an MD, how about if I want to take him to a traditional healer? But then my government won't let me do that. My government will let me do that only if that traditional healer is supervised by somebody from the AMA and with an MD from medical school.
This is going to be a wild book.
I hope so. I certainly hope so. Yes.